Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Stephen Legg. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Antigen Security, and I am joined by my lovely co-founder, Mr. Kyle
Okay.
Andrus,
Hi.
our Chief Technology Officer. We are here today as a part of an ongoing series of Ask Me Anythings that we're going to be doing every Wednesday moving forward from here. Will join, and I may have other folks from the Antigen team join for future episodes, but we wanted to kick it off here today with the two of us, since Kyle and I were the ones that actually founded Antigen originally. So um, we're going to be taking live questions from our audience. We've already pulled a number of questions from some of our customers, partners, and folks that we talk to. And we'll see kind of where we go from here. Do we have the first question? So I'll read it aloud. Why is MFA being required by cyber insurance carriers? What value does it provide? Kyle, you want to take a shot at this one?
Oh yeah. What we especially when you think of like many of the ransomware attacks that we have, or even fraud. Uh, One of the easiest ways that people get in is they basically phish someone for their credentials. They get the credentials and then just log in. With multi-factor authentication, that puts quite a bit of a hurdle in front of those actors, and it slows them down, if not prevents them from getting that initial access into your environment, whether it's just through email or through RDP or whatever potential connections to the internet that you may have for your company. And so it provides quite a bit of security protection and really helps companies kind of stay away from. I'll say like those fraud cases are probably something that we see very commonly too. Email gets compromised. They are get in the middle of a conversation between someone with an invoice, and that can all been stopped had they had MFA enabled.
Yeah, no, I was going to say the stat that I see get thrown around a lot within industry folks is that something like 81% of breaches involve an identity related attack. That's like an overwhelming majority. So MFA is one of those controls that, when implemented correctly, really helps curb all of those types of vectors of attack, and really, as Kyle said, kind of limits the damage that can be caused by anyone that, even if they do successfully, phish a credential or guess a password in some cases. Awesome, great question. Can we have our next question, please? So, next question is, what should I do to prepare for an incident if we've never had a conversation about it with our leadership team? I'll take the first pass, Kyle, and I'm sure you have thoughts on this also. So, in general, when talking about incident readiness with executives, I find that it's best to stay away from talking about security technologies or specifics of security implementation, and really try to focus on boiling it down into business outcomes. And so you can ask questions like, do we know what a breach would cost us, or a serious incident would cost us? Okay, let's talk about all the different pieces of that. There's the forensics requirement, which will be mandatory for any cyber insurance claim. There's recovery, getting everything back online, restoring backups, whatever, post incident. There's um, any new kind of security controls or things mandated or coming out of those circumstances based on what the forensics and other experts are saying. There's any regulatory fees or fines. There's cyber legal representation, engaging it with a breach coach, and those costs. And there's, of course, a litany of operational costs or impacts that would differ based on kind of your business and the type of organization that you are, and of course that in and of itself is a really healthy conversation to have. But Kyle, I guess what else would you want to add to that list?
No, and I always go down the technical path where my mind goes. So when I think of like what should I do to prepare for an incident, if I had conversation with leadership, I think of like, what are things that you could do in your current role that could potentially help you prepare for or start to get into that place where you will have some options or some tools in place already. Whether that's potentially having that contact for your forensic representative, whether to just ask questions or to have them come in with full service and kind of help you out. Like, do you know who you'd go to or what that would look like? I think of the other thing is like, your own asset inventory inside your company. Do you know what's critical and what you need to prepare for, or what you need to protect? Do you have backups for that stuff? Think of like, if you're in the infrastructure side and everything goes down and things are on fire, what are the things that could prevent those machines from being on fire, whether it's, like I said, backups or whatever. But start thinking about that stuff, and then when you have that conversation with leadership, you'd be like, hey, I already put together, like, here's the list of things that we know are important to the company. And back to like what Steve was saying, like, a lot of those bigger questions, like, are you ready, are you prepared, do you know what the dollar amount is? The findings from our infrastructure team can also tell us, like, yeah, oh, we forgot about these, so actually that costs even more. So it's a lot of collaboration between like your technical teams and your leadership to get to that point where like you're going to be in a much better place, and be able to respond to one of those incidents, and more efficiently, for sure.
Yeah, no, that all makes perfect sense. Well, and I have a question, Kyle, just based on your expertise and having gone through this a lot with customers. Um, do you think it's a valid kind of is there value in asking though that like those leaders or even the technical folks, I guess, what the priorities are in terms of
Yeah.
like disaster recovery, business continuity? What could you explain a little bit more about your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and sometimes when you're going through that process, you can even like make out a list where you have like your tier zero apps, which are like the most critical to like your business.
Yeah.
What would go in that tier zero? That might be, if you had billing web servers, it would be all of your infrastructure and the software, for that particular system, right? So
Hmm.
you'd have that in like a tier zero, and maybe something farther down the line could be, a software, like an internal tool that's used for helping organize something. If it went down, it would be bad, but the business would still be able to make money. So kind of like even tiering up, and having that priority of lists so that like what you can spend the most time on to protect. Because many times, like, you may not have the funds to protect everything in your environment, so you could at least focus on like the tier zero things. Focus on the most critical things in your environment. Uh, Look at like those entry points, whether it's going to be an RDP access, a VPN. Do you have SSH open to the internet? Hopefully not, or RDP open to the internet. Uh, you know, Things like that. Like, definitely, that's things that I think about. Like, if you want to protect the company, like, make sure you get those tier zero apps kind of like defined where they are, and that'll help with those discussions for costs and everything else.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it also really informs kind of your recovery strategy and what your business continuity and disaster recovery plans practically actually look like. Because I think a lot of folks that put those plans together and kind of think through and talk through, even folks that do tabletop exercises, they don't necessarily break it down to that. Because like in a full scale ransomware event, let's say everything is encrypted, right? When you're navigating those waters with all the third parties that are involved, your internal teams, your executives, everybody, and you have to communicate priority. If you're figuring that out in the moment, man, that is really hard.
Yeah, that becomes a very, stressful, intenseful, and very tense, period of time, and it could be avoided if you had those discussions ahead of time.
Yeah, and I think that's the what I would say is the main takeaway is have that conversation, right? Bring it up and talk through it. It's going to turn into multiple. I can almost guarantee. But it's all worthwhile because in the world of cyber insurance and cybersecurity, what's the phrase that they use? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, something like that. I forget what the phrase is, but
Yeah,
um, it's very true. If you make that kind of marginal investment of time and resources and energy ahead of time, it makes your life so much easier when things are really, really bad. And it can make things less bad in the end. So great question. Any other kind of final thoughts on that one before we move on, Kyle?
uh, I think the only last thing I would say is, like, when you define the other advantage of having those discussions ahead of time and defining what those core kind of critical, business systems are, can also, allow you to focus the funds that you do have for security. For example, like, implementing, software control across your environment
Mm,
is can be really difficult depending on the size of the organization and the complexity. But if you're able to list out like, hey, these 20 machines are the most critical in our company, we could just make a project and spend the money to protect those 20 machines with something like software control. That would be a much more feasible and actually, and it's more bang for your buck, right? So that's another thing to look at too, is when you are purchasing these security controls, implementing them, you can just start off by protecting your most critical assets. And then over time, as you invest, you can get everything else under it. But
Well, and that's a really common problem that we see with a lot of customers. You come across these things, new technologies, new measures, or even just kind of rethinking your plan and approach and wanting to cover everything, but your budgets aren't necessarily written with that in mind, right? So like you've got to figure out what the stopgap is and how to get there, short term and long term. And I think what you're proposing is really a good kind of stopgap to that conversation. Get the things protected that are critical, and then build it out from there.
yep.
Awesome. Well, so great. Can we have the next question, please? How can we protect ourselves from ransomware? What a great question. Do you want to take the first pass at this one, Kyle?
uh, oh man, there's so much you can do. You know, honestly, one of the first things really, or a good start, enable MFA.
Yeah.
you know,
Yes.
do that analysis of those critical systems in your environment. Make sure that you have backups. Uh, another big one is looking at what's exposed to the internet, like
Mm.
what can be touched by anyone from outside your organization. And then looking at those machines, making sure they're patched, making sure they have proper security controls on them. Uh, you know, and then that's a really great step. And then your next piece is really starting to look at the technology that can help you kind of stop, prevent, or recover more quickly. Uh, when a ransomware event happens, whether that's a combination of deploying our EDR, your software control type software, local firewall policies, and local segmentation, things like that. Um, yeah, definitely a big piece. Oh, and I will personally say that I'm a big fan of internet proxies. If you have a good internet proxy configured and all network traffic from all your users and everything else has to go through the proxy, and you can't just easily go to the internet, it that can be a huge control that can help as well, prevent a lot of the attacks that slip through. A phishing email will get through. Someone will click something, but many times, if you have a good proxy in place, good firewall rules, you can actually block some of that stuff before it even happens. So payloads just try to reach out to the internet to go to the next stage, and they just can't. So that's my personal thought.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think all the controls that you highlighted are really important. MFA, EDR, I think MDR is worth mentioning. If you don't have a dedicated threat intel and detection engineering team, you should really have an MDR behind your team helping to augment those functions. Um, you mentioned segmentation, proxy. I would kind of I know the word zero trust is thrown around a lot as a buzzword, but zero trust segmentation and zero trust network access are probably two of the most important layers at this point of security, to your point, Kyle, of in terms of like just containing the blast radius of things that actually get through. Because if you have those controls in place, it's like you're segmenting or isolating all of that activity into that particular machine, or even network segment that the activity is happening, and that can greatly reduce the severity, scope, and impact of anything that does make it through. um, all of those things are great conversations to have. I think the other thing worth doing is, once a year you should be tabletopping a ransomware scenario, um, going through all that, understanding, with somebody, whether it's from your team or a third party or whatever, have it led by somebody that knows and has been through ransomware, so they can explain kind of how some of those controls get circumvented and what underlying assumptions can be made. Because really, ransomware is not only a great test, in my opinion, of an instant response plan and like security responders, but it's also a great test of business continuity and disaster recovery. Because if as I said before, if the entire environment gets ransomed, and is offline. And to the point you made earlier about identifying the different tiers of priorities in terms of recovery, do you know how to actually action that? I always like to joke, a disaster recovery or business continuity plan that hasn't been tested is just a theory. And if you go down that path, you step through those recovery motions, business continuity motions. Stand up your secondary system, stand up your DR site, stand up and step through restoring some of those kind of critical applications, and make sure you understand all the nuance that's going to be involved, because everything works when it's in place and as it's been set in motion and just kind of statically doing its job. But when that breaks and you have to fit it all back together, you find out all the edges that that don't line up quite right. And uh and and we see this all the time, both with digital forensics and recovery engagements as well. um it can really create some engineering challenges that are not easy to overcome. And so you can, as Kyle said, get ahead of a lot of that stuff by having those conversations early, putting those measures in place, and then of course, as I mentioned, testing them in a tabletop exercise, and make sure the team has that muscle memory for when the bad day comes. Great question. Were there any other kind of final thoughts that you had on that one, Kyle?
Yeah, I would very much agree that like a ransomware assessment is incredibly useful, because like you're just kind of mentioning all those pieces, but like the fact that you're not only testing like what like a normal pen test would be, like can they break
Hmm.
in and do things,
Yeah.
but specifically like the behaviors around what ransomware does, and can you see that in your environment, can you respond to it, and then the actions that occur once things get encrypted and everything's broken, is, are you able to recover from that? Is your business continuity plan ready for it? Have you
Hmm.
tested it? It's that really does, like I feel like ransomware assessments are like fantastic because they really cover such a large base of stuff,
Hmm.
and at the end of it, you're gonna get you're gonna get a good report of and also some priorities for where you can focus some of that effort. So it'll give you a good starting point, like how our organization's here. Here's our red findings that we got to go through first, and if we get these done, it's going to greatly elevate us away from like a ton of risk that we might have if ransomware occurs. So yeah,
Yeah, completely agree. That's a an upcoming trend, I would say, is doing those types of specific engagements to actually put those plans through their paces with a live scenario. Completely agreed.
and
Awesome. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
and you definitely like the from the detection side, when you look at EDR and like the MDR providers, a really big piece or a very strong thing that you get out of that is a combination of that MDR provider should be giving you good threat intel, making new detections, and being kind of like in a constant like in contact with you,
Hmm.
because pretty much today, if you want to stay ahead of ransomware or really any of these new attacks that get entry into your environment, you really have to be kind of having your finger on the pulse for the threat intelligence side, and then also being able to kind of create detections for your own environment. What's unique to your company?
Hmm.
Because if you just bring in like a default tool and you just have it run the default detections it has, it can do a pretty good job of protecting you of most stuff. But any of the new stuff that drops or a little bit more cutting edge, not even cutting edge, just newer things that have dropped, they may not have detections in time.
Hmm.
And there's also the possibility that you could write more concise rules to protect maybe those just top 20 things. You could have much more aggressive like rules that look for any kind of activity, which might not be possible, but a good MDR provider that you work with could really help you through that stuff, and you can get some great results. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. I think the best MDR providers are creating new detections and iterating that all the time based on actual threat activity, and that should be one of the things you pay the most attention to when you're
Yeah,
selecting an MDR partner. Um, Completely agree with that. Well, awesome. Any other final thoughts before we move on to the next question?
that's it. That's all I
All
got.
right, all right. We'll take the next question. I've heard about folks paying less for ransom or avoiding paying it at all. How can I make sure my organization can achieve these outcomes? Ooh, that's a good question. I my off the cuff answer is that it depends on your organization, but in general, um, I think that having the right technical controls in place plays one role. Having an immutable backup strategy plays another role. And when I say immutable backup strategy, I think the way I define it is you should have a minimum of 3 tiers of backups, and there should be separation and security between those tiers. So you should have kind of those short term or like file level, easy to access backups that are kind of local on the network, for any of those like users that deleted a file, something that gets misplaced, destroyed because of some hardware or other reason, whatever. Um, all those kind of short-term losses. Then you should have kind of your image level backups that are kind of short to mid-term retention and window wise. And then you should have an out of band clone of those that are more archival focused, that are not accessible from any of the other systems that are backing those up. And that's my, from a strategic perspective, because that's the primary vantage point I'm usually speaking to this from. Those are the things in my eyes that definitively separate organizations that end up having to pay to get a decryptor, or having to work with a threat actor to get access back to their data or systems, versus ones that don't. I'm sure you have other thoughts, Kyle. We could talk about this particular question all day, I think.
Yeah, and it's a difficult one, right? Because like when it comes down to much like what you just described, like depending on the maturity of your organization, where you're at to respond to a ransomware event, may put you in a very different spot than another company. If an actor came in and they were able to encrypt all your machines, but also all of your backups and everything else, and you have nothing, then it's going to be really difficult for you to like try and pay less for a ransom because they know that they got you.
Yeah.
And the other thing is like they'll do like the double kind of extortion where they encrypt it and they also pull some sensitive information out. And
Mhm.
those discussions are really it's a difficult discussion to have. It's not just your technical teams and leadership; it's also pulling in all your legal, and it's it's a hard question to get to. But at some point, you have to say like, what can we afford to actually pay back for? What do we need for the business to continue to run?
Mhm.
And then whether or not the actors are going to even have wiggle room for you, right? Like some actors, they'll have wiggle room because they just want to get paid. The easiest way they can get paid, they're good to go. Other ones are jerks. They're just like, nope, it's this or nothing.
Yep.
So it's such like a roll of the dice. I feel. While roll the dice for like what threat actor you get, right? That's whether they're gonna be a jerk or not. And then the one piece you can control is a lot of what you just described, having those procedures in place, offline backups, all stuff like that. Like that's going to put you in a better place to negotiate with these actors if they do get inside the environment.
Yeah, I think you touched on a lot of points, and just to summarize, I think what you're saying is you need to put the leverage back in your own hands by having those things thought through ahead of time. And I agree, from a negotiation perspective, that's pretty critical,
Yeah,
because if they know they have you, they're not going to budge an inch, right? They're gonna hold the line and try to get as much money as possible out of you, because they know they've got you, and they're smart. They do this professionally.
yeah,
So they're familiar with what they need to explore and how they can set you in that position to the extent that they're capable of doing that. Um, but the other, I guess, kind of key piece there is what I would say um, comes down to what we talked about before in terms of having those conversations ahead of those incidents. Because if you identify, hey, we if our cost is this, and we estimate that a ransom could be anywhere between this number and this number, why aren't we taking some portion of that and investing it in the security controls that we're missing, so that we never have to pay this, or it's very unlikely that we would have to pay this, right? That's another great way to have those conversations kind of at that senior executive level.
yeah.
Always bring it back to cost and business impact. um anyway, sorry. As I said, we could probably talk about that topic all day. I know we have one last question, so I want to make sure we get to it here. um Kyle, do you want to read this one?
Yeah, like how can I break into the security industry? What advice would you give to someone who is making that transition from a background in technology?
I uh, this one is very near and dear to both of our hearts. I don't know. Do you want to take the first pass, or do you want me to take a shot?
Uh, sure. I'll start. and it's near and dear to our hearts because Steve and I both have been in the security community for many years, and a big piece of that was just trying to get people excited, and anyone that wanted to join into InfoSec, we would do everything that we could to kind of make it easier, lower the bar of entry so that they could start. I will say, if you're coming from a background in technology, it's a lot easier to kind of get into the security industry. Because you have that basic knowledge of your operating system, software, firewalls, networking. You don't have to be perfect at all of them. Scripting, programming languages, because that base kind of knowledge of your IT skill set, and security is an advanced discipline that sits on top of that. So the better and stronger you are at your base IT skills, the easier it is for you to kind of move into really almost anything inside of the security industry. You know, and when we look at like the job roles that are out there today and where you can kind of move and where you can focus in, there's just so much out there that's it's really cool. Like the fact that there's detection engineering specific jobs now, or you know, the threat intelligence that's now, like, that role in particular is becoming more often. Threat hunting, or as the industry is I don't know if it's the industry as much as people on Twitter are now trying to say that it's called thrunting. That when you're threat hunting, I'm going on a thrunt. I like it. I like it. I'm gonna keep. It's good. But you know, like, you know, threat hunting roles, your classic incident response roles. Like there's a lot there, and then on top of that, like the risk and privacy stuff that you do within the security industry. Security engineering as a whole is huge, of course, because you got to build all this stuff, maintain it, keep it up. You know, it's just there's a lot. There's very much a lot that you can go into, and yeah. But yeah, starting off, definitely look around for any local communities that might be open in your area, right? If you're close to larger cities, they tend to have some type of like CitySec or some type of InfoSec community. Sometimes it can be difficult to find them, but if you poke around enough, you usually can. And B-sides events are very common through most cities. And usually on Twitter, you can find the B-sides Twitter account, or maybe even they have a web page, and you can ping that the email on that web page, or ping the people on Twitter, and they may have other suggestions like, oh yeah, we're aware that, you know, these events are going on here. This is other places you can go. But that's definitely a great way to start to get your feel in the environment, or in InfoSec. Meet other people that are doing all these different types of roles, and then kind of get an idea like maybe what you like or where you might want to see your career go.
Yeah, 100%. I agree wholeheartedly with what you said. Everything, from the bottom up. I think B-sides organizations are a great way to get a pulse on and get connected with a lot of the folks that are volunteering around you locally, looking for those like CitySec groups or other information security groups. CTF teams are often a fun way to break in and do some of that work, and get a little hands-on with it ahead of any kind of a job role. I know we're wrapping up here, and I'm sure we could go on forever on that last topic. But if there were any final questions, I want to offer them up now because we do have to wrap up here shortly. So, were there any other questions? I'll ask our organizers.
Yes.
Looks like no. It looks like this is the last one. Okay. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Really appreciate everyone coming out and participating. And we'll keep an eye out for your questions next week. And in the future, you can join us here on Wednesdays. More details to be announced from our social media, so keep an eye out there. And really glad to have you on with me to do this AMA, Kyle. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome, guys. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. See you next time.
The classic Zoom wave. Goodbye, everybody.